December 2023, and HMS Diamond is running at reduced power somewhere in the Persian Gulf. The warm water is overheating her engines, and this is not a minor inconvenience to manage around. This is a Type 45 destroyer, the most advanced air defense warship Britain has ever built, and she cannot operate at full capacity in the region where she is most needed because a design flaw in an intercooler attached to her gas turbines produces catastrophic power loss the moment water temperature climbs. Not gradual degradation, catastrophic. A ship that cost over £1 billion to build cannot reliably function in warm seas. And yet that same ship, on December 16, fired a Sea Viper missile and destroyed a drone targeting merchant shipping in the Red Sea, marking the first time the Royal Navy brought down an aerial target in actual combat since the 1991 Gulf War. A flawed, aging, power-limited destroyer doing a job that no other vessel in the British fleet could do at that moment. Now, the Ministry of Defense has announced it is scrapping plans to replace her, and that is where things get genuinely interesting. Britain operates 6 Type 45 destroyers, and as of early 2026, only 3 of them are available for operational duties. The plan to build their successors, designated the Type 83, has been formally dropped. In its place, the government is proposing something called the Common Combat Vessel, a drone command hub designed not to fight directly, but to serve as a control center for unmanned systems operating across air, surface, and underwater domains. Whether that represents a bold strategic shift or an expensive gamble dressed in the language of innovation depends entirely on what you think the Royal Navy actually needs to do and whether the money has ever existed to do it properly. On that second point, history is not encouraging. To understand how Britain arrived at this decision, you need to go back to where the Type 45 came from, and more specifically, what problem it was built to solve. In the late 1990s, the Royal Navy was still operating the Type 42 destroyer, a ship that had seen combat in the Falklands War. The Type 42 had performed. It brought down Argentine aircraft. But it had also been struck by Exocet missiles during that campaign, with devastating consequences for the crews aboard HMS Sheffield and HMS Coventry. The lesson from the South Atlantic was unambiguous. Britain needed a fundamentally better AIR defense capability, something capable of handling the fast, low-level, sea-skimming missiles that were becoming the defining threat of modern naval warfare. The Type 45 became that answer. The program had its roots in a cancelled NATO project called NFR-90, and the missile system at its heart, the principal anti-air missile system, was developed collaboratively with France and Italy, whose Horizon-class frigates carried the same PAMS architecture under a different designation. Britain's version, carrying Aster 15 and Aster 30 missiles, with a combat management system capable of tracking and engaging multiple targets simultaneously, arrived with a reputation as the most capable air defense destroyer in the world. HMS Daring, the first of the class, was commissioned in 2009 and set the standard by which everything that followed would be judged. The program began with 12 ships planned, then 8, then 6, with each reduction justified on cost grounds, and the total bill climbing from an original budget of roughly £4.5 billion to a final figure of £6.46 billion, a cost increase of £1.5 billion, nearly 30% above what had been promised to Parliament. 6 ships instead of 12, costing 30% more than projected, which is either a procurement failure or a tradition depending on how long you've been watching British defense spending. And then the engine problem emerged. The Type 45 was built around an integrated electric propulsion system, a design in which the WR-21 gas turbines generate electricity that then drives the ship rather than connecting directly to the propeller shafts. The WR-21 turbines themselves were fitted with Northrop Grumman intercoolers, and those intercoolers perform well enough in cold northern Atlantic water. In the warmer temperatures of the Persian Gulf, they fail, and the failure is not the kind you can manage through careful throttle work. The turbines lose power, the ship loses propulsion. This did not surface during testing. It emerged operationally when ships actually deployed to the Gulf and found themselves unable to sustain full capability in the theater where the threat was most concentrated. The full scale of the problem became public in 2016. a power improvement package was agreed, and work on the first ship did not begin until 2020. By 2026, the program was still running, with only 3 of the 6 ships available for operational duties at any given moment. So, £6.5 billion, 6 destroyers, half of them unavailable, and the plan to build their replacements has just been scrapped. Here's the thing about the Type 83 program. The entire concept phase received approximately £1.32 million in platform-specific design funding across 3 financial years. Defense Minister Luke Pollard stood up in Parliament and told members the program had been inherited in an underdeveloped state, which is parliamentary language for there was no real plan. There was a name, there was some concept work involving laser weapons, AI-powered digital systems, and electronic propulsion. There was a vision statement from Commodore Michael Wood describing an evolution of the Type 45, and there was £1.3 million for a major warship program. You could spend that much on the catering for a commissioning ceremony and still have questions about the canopus. Into that gap steps the Common Combat Vessel. The Ministry of Defense describes the CCV as a control hub for a family of unmanned platforms, and it has given those platforms specific designations. The Type 91 handles missiles. The Type 92 focuses on underwater sensing. The Type 93 operates as an extra-large, uncrewed underwater vehicle. The Type 94 carries sensors. Together, these systems are meant to extend the reach and firepower of the fleet without requiring a proportional increase in crew size or cost. At least 6 common combat vessels will be built, with initial deliveries expected from the early 2030s, and they will operate alongside 8 Type 26 frigates and 5 Type 31 frigates to form what the Royal Navy is calling the Hybrid Navy. Crucially, the Type 45s have historically been the cornerstone of Carrier Strike Group escort duties, screening HMS Queen Elizabeth and HMS Prince of Wales from air threats. The CCV will need to demonstrate it can fill that role before the last Type 45 pays off. The broader framework includes Project Beehive, a plan for 20 uncrewed surface vessels, plus AUKUS-backed underwater drone development, and 3 new Atlantic programs called Atlantic Bastion, Atlantic Shield, and Atlantic Strike, each structured around countering Russian activity in the North Atlantic and the High North. The architecture is coherent on paper. The exact size, shape, cost, and capability of the common combat vessels themselves, however, remains to be determined. Those details will be worked out at a later stage. This is described in official documents as flexible procurement, which is one way to frame spending public money on ships whose specifications have not yet been confirmed. Forget what the press releases say for a moment. Here is what the contractors are quietly working through. BAE Systems presented a System of Systems architecture at DSEI 2025 and is actively reviewing options that could evolve the CCV from the proven Type 26 hull. Babcock, meanwhile, is pitching a Type 31-based approach under a concept called Armor Force. 2 major industrial competitors, 2 different hull solutions, and a government program with no confirmed design. The competition is real. The clock is running. Now the central question. Does the hybrid model actually solve the problem the Type 45 was built to solve? The argument in favor is not trivial. Modern adversaries are fielding large numbers of relatively cheap unmanned systems, and the conflict in Ukraine made it unmistakably clear that expensive, high-value platforms are extraordinarily vulnerable to low-cost drone strikes. Concentrating billions of pounds of capability into 6 destroyers creates 6 high-value targets, each one representing a disproportionate loss if taken out of action. Distributed unmanned systems are harder to target, cheaper to replace, and more adaptable as threats evolve. First Sea Lord Sir Gwyn Jenkins has argued that the shift reflects a genuine strategic choice, matching the fleet to the warfare of the 2030s rather than the warfare of the previous generation. The argument against is equally direct. The Type 45, for all its faults, carries a proven air defense capability. HMS Diamond demonstrated that in December 2023, and no amount of drone coordination software replicates an Aster 30 missile intercepting a high-speed aerial threat. a common combat vessel that directs unmanned systems, is categorically not the same thing as a warship that can fire a missile at an incoming threat. It is also worth noting that the existing Type 45 fleet is already being upgraded with Sea Scepter missiles, adding a mid-range layer beneath the Aster systems to provide more comprehensive layered air defense than the ships originally carried. That is the standard a common combat vessel will eventually need to match or exceed. The hybrid fleet concept depends on unmanned systems still in development, operating in contested environments, coordinated by ships whose specifications haven't been finalized yet. Shadow Defense Secretary James Cartledge described the plans as too little, too late, and framed the entire pivot as a budget decision dressed up as a strategy. That contested claim sits at the heart of the story, and the defense budget does not settle it cleanly. The Defense Investment Plan settlement reached approximately £14.5 billion, up from the $13.5 billion that former Defense Secretary John Healey was offered before he resigned on June 11, 2025, describing the figure as falling well short of what was needed. Officials had previously stated that $28 billion would be required to properly fund the plan. The final settlement came in at roughly half that, which means Defense Secretary Dan Jarvis secured more than his predecessor was offered, but still far less than the department's own assessment of what the job costs. Whether the common combat vessel concept is strategically sound on its own terms, the financial context in which it was chosen is sitting right there in the public record. By comparison, the existing Type 45 ships are still receiving significant investment. MBDA UK is under contract to deliver 2 DragonFire laser-based directed energy weapon systems, with the first ship scheduled to receive one in 2027, which would make Britain the first European NATO nation to deploy a shipborne laser weapon. Laser weapons being fitted to destroyers already scheduled for retirement. That is either a serious commitment to maintaining capability during the transition period, or the naval equivalent of renovating a house you are already planning to demolish. The calendar will eventually tell us which interpretation was correct. What sits beneath all of this is a procurement cycle that has repeated itself across decades. 12 ships become 6. 6 ships cost 30% more than planned. Half of those 6 are unavailable. The replacement program is underfunded and underdeveloped. The successor to that replacement is now a concept with no confirmed specifications, built around technology that does not yet fully exist, scheduled for delivery at an unspecified point in the 2030s. And through every iteration of this cycle, Russian submarine activity in the North Atlantic has been climbing to levels not recorded since the Cold War, which is precisely the threat environment these future ships are meant to address. That same activity also places pressure on CASD, the Continuous At-Sea Deterrent, which the surface fleet exists in part to protect. The UN Crewed Systems Task Force established at a drone facility in Swindon will be central to bridging the gap in the interim, and the Atlantic programs give the hybrid Navy concept a geographic and operational frame. Atlantic Bastion covers defensive operations in home waters. Atlantic Shield addresses the broader North Atlantic. Atlantic Strike covers offensive reach. The architecture has been announced ahead of the NATO summit, which is not a coincidence. Britain is signaling to allies that it has a plan, even while the hardware that would execute that plan is still years away from the drawing board. The strategic paradox underneath all of this is worth sitting with. Britain is betting that a drone command platform can replace the dedicated high-end air defense the Type 45 provides. At exactly the moment when Russian activity in the Atlantic and missile threats across multiple theaters are more acute than they have been in a generation, that bet may prove to be correct. Distributed UN manned systems may turn out to be precisely the right answer to the threats of the 2030s, and a fleet of common combat vessels coordinating autonomous platforms may deliver more operational resilience than 6 conventional destroyers ever could. Or the window between the Type 45 reaching the end of its service life and the common combat vessel reaching genuine operational readiness may turn out to be the most consequential capability gap in the modern Royal Navy's history. The decisions that will resolve that question are all still ahead. what the common combat vessels actually look like, what they can actually do, and whether the unmanned systems they are designed to control are ready in time, none of that has been settled. The Type 45 replacement story is, in the most literal sense, unfinished. When the specifications land, when the contracts are awarded, and when the first CCV takes shape in a British shipyard, this channel will be covering it. If that kind of analysis interests you, stay subscribed, because the next chapter of this story is already in motion. 6 ships built to be the world's best. 3 available today. Their replacements canceled. Drone hubs ordered, specifications pending, delivery date approximate. That is where Britain's air defense capability stands right now, and the gap between where it stands and where it needs to be is not a theoretical concern. It is a present one.